Last couple of hours, there has, as is often the way, been a reduction of information about the events on the battlefronts in Ukraine. I get the sense that the Russians have continued advancing in the Bakhmut area, pushing towards Chasiv Yar. They're apparently taken more of the areas around Bogdanovka, this village to the northwest of Bakhmut, under control. And with Bogdanovka apparently in effect a suburb of Chasiv Yar, we will soon no doubt be getting to a position where the battle for that town, Chasiv Yar, begins. There's also been more reports of more Russian advances in the Avdiivka area along the railway line, and also of the Russians continuing to gradually push the Ukrainians back in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area in Zaporozhye region, the area where Ukraine conducted most of its summer offensive. Against that, there are some reports that the Russians have actually pulled out of the village of Sinkovka near Kupiansk. They apparently found Ukrainian resistance there too strong, and they're said to be redeploying their forces. Dima at the military summary channel has mentioned this, and I understand it's been reported elsewhere as well. So, continued Russian pressure along the front lines, but perhaps less information from the front lines that we have been receiving over the last few days and few weeks. There was, just to quickly add, a report of a large group of Ukrainian soldiers in boats being sent to the Klinky bridgehead on the east bank of the Dnieper River in Kherson region, and of that group being intercepted by Russian artillery and drones, and of many people dying. And there's more reports of that bridgehead gradually shrinking in size. But it seems, extraordinary though it appears, that the Ukrainian military remain committed to maintaining this bridgehead and continue to send troops to Klinky, where many of them, of course, lose their lives. But anyway, less news than we have had over the last couple of days and weeks, and that may be connected to the fact that on Saturday, Russian Orthodox Christians celebrate Christmas. Christmas Day is celebrated on the 7th of January in the Russian Orthodox world. And there are, incidentally, rumors circulating that President Putin is going to be making an announcement very soon. And the rumors also suggest that, as he did last year, he is going to announce a Christmas truce. Now, if he does that, I'm going to say straight away that I don't think that Ukraine is going to uphold this truce. They said they weren't going to last year. Since last year, the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian authorities have made more efforts to suppress the old Orthodox Church in Ukraine and to substitute for it this new church that they have sponsored with the backing of the Patriarch of Constantinople. And as I understand it, this new church celebrates Christmas Day on the 25th of December, not the 7th of January. They have broken with the Russian Orthodox Church on the question of the celebration of Christmas, and that will therefore give the Ukrainian authorities even less reason to say that they abide by the Christmas truce. So it will be a one-sided truce, which means that there will be no truce at all. It will certainly not be a ceasefire. But it might result, as it did last year, in a slackening of Russian offensive actions along the front lines for a couple of days. And I would not personally be surprised if we saw something like this happen. Anyway, that's a possibility we need to keep in mind. but we don't have the facts for it yet. We'll wait and see what Putin says and what he announces. In the meantime, however, we are getting more and more news and information about what is increasingly looking like the big event of the last week, which is this second big Russian missile and drone strike. And the Russian Defense Ministry has now provided its own account of the big Russian missile and drone strike that took place on the night of the 2nd of January. And this is what it has said. The armed forces of the Russian Federation delivered a group strike with high-precision, long-range weapons and unmanned aerial vehicles on enterprises of the military-industrial complex of Ukraine that carried out orders for the production of missiles, unmanned aerial vehicles, and repair of weapons and military hardware in Kiev and its suburbs, as well as storage sites for missiles, ammunition, and aircraft weapons supplied to the Kiev regime by Western countries. The purpose of the strike has been achieved. All the targets have been engaged. So here we have the Russians saying that their missile strike, their missile and drone strike, which was, as I discussed, an enormous affair, conducted apparently in 4 waves, that this strike was successful, that all the targets were hit, and they claim that an enormous amount of damage was done. Now, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry has apparently published its own account of this attack on Kiev, and if you follow it, you would get the impression that the attack was a complete failure. As I understand it, they claimed that they shot down all of the Kinzhal missiles that were launched against Kiev. They claimed to have shot down all of the KH-101 missiles that were launched against Kiev. And they also claimed to have shot down all the Uranium-2 drones that were launched against Kiev. They do concede that some of the ballistic missiles that they also say were launched against Kiev, that they managed to get through. Well, if that is what the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense is claiming, then I'm afraid I get to say straight away that I don't believe these claims. In fact, one claim that I saw being circulated, which I think I discussed in my earlier video describing this missile strike, one particular claim based on a film of a missile tumbling down from the sky into the Dnieper, which I saw reported in the Daily Telegraph, based apparently on Ukrainian sources. The Daily Telegraph said that this was a Kinzhal missile that had been hit and which had gone off course. I said that I wasn't able to identify the missile, but that the missile looked to me as if it was intact, and maybe it was an air defense missile. Well, that particular incident has now been clarified. It was not a Kinzhal missile. It was an Iris-T air defense missile launched by Ukraine. It missed its target and tumbled into the Dnieper. And somebody apparently was able to film it. So that's one Ukrainian claim, maybe not from the Defense Ministry itself, but that was one Ukrainian claim taken as being sufficiently authoritative for the Daily Telegraph to republish, which turns out to have been untrue. But in fact, we've been getting lots of other reports. There's been reports by all sorts of Ukrainian officials, all of them saying that particular industrial and logistical facilities around Kiev were indeed hit. And in fact, there's been one particular really very dramatic picture which shows a big explosion, and you see, and you can get the stills of the film, you see a red hot missile crashing before this explosion. And most people who have seen this confirm that that is a Kinjal, and that Kinjal clearly was not intercepted and does appear to be hitting whatever target it was launched against. And it's been suggested as well that the strikes, the missile strikes, did indeed manage to cause damage to one particular Patriot missile battery in the Kiev area, and that a warehouse containing Patriot missile systems was indeed destroyed, exactly as the Russian Ministry of Defense claims, and that apparently some other Ukrainian air defense systems, NASAMS or IRIS-Ts, were destroyed as well. So, on the face of it, a devastating strike. And I have to say also that that film that I saw yesterday of a KH-101 missile flying over Kiev with no sign of any attempt being made to intercept it, to my mind, that also suggests an overall failure of the air defense system in Kiev. And I have no doubt that that is actually what happened. So, there we go. Now, there are a lot more rumors circulating about this missile strike. There's claims that it wasn't just one Patriot missile system that was destroyed, for example. There's claims that a very senior official, an Associate General Zaluzhny, was killed over this missile strike, cause of this missile strike. There's also claims that a major bunker with command staff was also destroyed. These reports are, of course, all uncorroborated. They're the kind of reports that swirl around and get discussed at these times, and one can't say that they're true because there is absolutely no evidence to corroborate them. But, as does occasionally happen, I have someone who has been in contact with me in the past and who has been contacted me again, and this person does have a significant amount of information, and or says he does, and as I have alluded to in the past, the information that he tends to provide, that he provides actually, not tends to provide, the information that he provides has been consistently shown to be true. So this person has provided a certain amount of information about the missile strike that took place on Kiev on the 2nd of January and on the previous big missile strike that took place on the 29th of December. And I should say that this person is able to obtain information, or appears to be able to obtain information, from both Russian and Western sources. So it's interesting. Anyway, he says that one of the factors that causes confusion for the Ukrainian air defenses is that the Russians routinely launch, together with all their other missiles, KH-55 old cruise missiles left over from the Soviet period. They have similar flight characteristics to KH-101s. They're less advanced, and they don't carry warheads, but they act as decoys, and they regularly cause confusion and disruption to the Ukrainian Air Defense Command. He also says that the Western powers and the Ukrainians have made a very big effort to upgrade the performance of the Patriot missile system around Kiev, precisely in order to intercept Kinjal missiles. And he says that the way that this has been done is that the Ukrainians, along with the Patriot missile systems, have been provided with advanced AESA radars manufactured in Israel as part of the Iron Dome system, and that these particular radars do have an ability to track very, very high speed missiles and can to some extent estimate where they might be falling towards. And he says that the combination of these radars with the Patriots means that sometimes, not very often, but occasionally, if the Ukrainians and their controllers are lucky, they might be able to intercept a Kinjal missile as it falls. However, according to Russian calculations, this only happens around 10 to 15% of the time. And since several Patriot missiles have to be launched at the target in order for this to happen, and since remarkably the Kinjals are cheaper than the Patriots, from a Russian point of view, this continues to be a reasonably good trade. He also says that not only do most of the Kinjals strike their targets, but that the Russians have indeed increased production of Kinjal missiles by a very considerable margin, though he does not know the exact numbers, and that we will be seeing more of these Kinjals operating over Kiev. And just to reiterate again, the ability of the Patriot system, even with these new radars, to intercept the Kinjal remains very limited indeed. He also says that the Russians are indeed hunting the air defense systems, that they're busy destroying launchers when they can, and that they are indeed, exactly as I speculated in my previous video, hunting radars and are proving quite successful, and that they are indeed also hunting and attacking and destroying the positions where the operators are located. And this person, again, I have to be very careful because I don't want to say enough to work out the identity of this person, but this person says that the Russians at least believe that some of these operators must be Westerners, that it would be impossible, or well nigh impossible, for Ukrainians to have been integrated, to have been trained up to the level where they could operate a very complex air defense system like this. And in summary, the general sense appears to be that the air defense system in Kiev is indeed becoming degraded. He also said that it is indeed correct that that the Ukrainians have never managed to intercept the enormous Kh-22 and 32 missiles that are launched by the Tupolev 22 M3 bombers, that these particular missiles have also been upgraded in order to make interception of these missiles more difficult. But anyway, the long and the short of it is, more missiles, more air defense missiles are being lost. Production of air defense missiles in the West cannot keep up remotely with the extent to which Ukraine is expending them. More launchers are being destroyed, more radars are being destroyed, and more operators are being targeted and in a number of cases apparently have been killed. So there we go. And this after just the second big missile strike. Now, the British Ministry of Defence is saying that the Russians have significantly depleted their stock of missiles as a result of these two big missile strikes. And of course, they have indeed used a large number of missiles over the course of these two missile strikes. But in the case of this particular claim that the Russians are running out of missiles, well, we have heard this before. This claim has been repeatedly made. I remember back in March 2022, right at the start of this conflict, the Daily Telegraph was claiming that the Russians were about to run out of cruise missiles because the cruise missiles all used engines, turbojet engines, supplied by the Motorsic factory in Ukraine, that because Motorsic no longer supplied Russia with these jet engines, Russian production of cruise missiles was about to stop. And that was written in March 2022, as I well remember. And here we are in January 2024, and the Russian missile strikes have resumed on a larger scale than at any previous time in the war. And they become more sophisticated and they become more complicated. They become more fully designed. The missiles have become more accurate. They follow more complex flight paths, at least the subsonic ones do. And I have no reason to think that the British Ministry of Defence is right. I mean, obviously, the Russians have used up a lot of missiles, but I'm sure that they have many more. And virtually everybody acknowledges that their production of missiles has substantially increased. So there we go. So a very powerful missile strike. It did manage to destroy quite a few facilities in and around Kiev, and it has caused damage. It has further weakened the air defense system around Kiev. Now, what the Russians intend to do over the next few days, there was a Ukrainian official who said that the Russians need around 4 days before they carry out another strike. This is because they need to assess the damage of the first strike and then plan the second. Maybe 4 days is too short a time frame. Maybe we won't see another missile strike until next month. Who's to say? But one way or the other, I'm confident that the Russians will be launching many more missile strikes of this kind. And you can get the sense that both in Ukraine and in the West, they are becoming increasingly worried about this. And one person who is clearly becoming very alarmed is the new Polish foreign minister. Actually, he is the old Polish foreign minister. He's none other than Radek Sikorski. He's been foreign minister of Poland before in an earlier government headed by Donald Tusk. Donald Tusk is once again Prime Minister of Poland, and Radek Sikorski is again Poland's foreign minister. And he has called for Ukraine to be supplied with more air defense missiles, and he has also called for Ukraine to be supplied with more long-range cruise missiles sufficiently long-range that they can strike targets in Russia itself, deep inside Russia. And he's clearly talking about the Taurus missiles that Germany has been considering supplying to Ukraine. Perhaps he's also thinking of Tomahawk missiles and those things that the United States also has. Now, I don't know whether the Germans will supply the Taurus missile. Probably they will. In fact, I'm sure they will. But I suspect that for the moment at least, the United States will balk at supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine. I think that eventually, if things continue in the way they have, it might come to that. But for the moment, I think this proposal would be unwelcome in the United States, bearing in mind how unpopular the conflict in Ukraine is starting to become with more and more people there. It's also been pointed out, for example, by Simplicius the Thinker, that the Russians are launching many more missiles on Ukraine, not just many more missiles than people had in the West had assumed that they had when the war began, but that the Russians are outproducing the West in cruise missiles, in Tomahawk missiles specifically. Apparently, there are quite a few thousand Tomahawk missiles spread out across the vast United States military, but there aren't unlimited quantities of these things, and the Tomahawk missiles are an absolutely essential part of the US military system. They are the kind of missiles that the United States would use, for example, if it were to decide to launch a missile strike on Iran, or if it were to try to launch a missile strike on China as part of some kind of conflict in the Taiwan Straits or the South China Sea. In other words, supplying Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine would be deeply controversial with the Pentagon if it reduced the overall stockpile, which it would almost certainly quickly start to do. And I suspect that there would be more opposition to this transfer than to any other weapon that has been discussed up to now. So anyway, the fact that Sikorski is talking in this way, to my mind, shows the extent to which people in the West, governments in the West, governments and the government in Kiev itself have been shaken by these two particular big missile attacks. And to repeat again a point that I've made in previous programs, the Russians have not yet used all of their available types of missiles in these attacks. They have not yet, for example, used their Zircon hypersonic missile, which is a cruise missile, operates in an entirely different way from the Kinjal. If there might conceivably, through the use of apparently enormously expensive Israeli-built Iron Dome radars, be a potential way that a Patriot could be used, the Patriot system could be used to shoot down Kinjals, then that way would not work with a Zircon missile, which is a cruise missile, which nonetheless can operate apparently at speeds of Mach 10, which there is no conceivable air defense that exists in the West. Whether the Russians will, of course, deploy the Zircon in Ukraine, we have no way of knowing. So there we go. A massive, enormous attack. Probably there will be more attacks of this kind. Definite damage done to Ukrainian military industrial facilities and a weakening of the air defense system in Ukraine. Alarmed comments from the Foreign Minister of Poland and the British Ministry of Defence trying to find some gleanings of hope out of all of this by saying that, well, the Russians have used a lot of missiles and that means that they have fewer than they did, which is true, but doesn't actually take us very far. Now, all of this happening despite the fact that, again, there is no sign, no indication at the moment of any kind of political strategy about what to do with respect to Ukraine. There are signs of growing tension now in certain European capitals, and an Italian newspaper, La Repubblica, has just published a story that there is talk within the SPD, the biggest party in the German coalition, the ruling coalition, that there is talk within the SPD of dumping Olaf Scholz, the Chancellor, and replacing him with Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, who is said to be more popular than Olaf Scholz. Well, if that does indeed happen, and again, I want to stress these are rumors at the moment, and one does wonder what La Repubblica's sources are. But anyway, if this does indeed happen, then, as far as I can see, it would be a case of simply switching the captain of the Titanic after the Titanic has already crashed into the iceberg. I can't see how it can possibly change the course, the situation of the German coalition government. Scholz is the Chancellor. It's an enormously powerful post within the German political system. He has played a very important role in the decision-making processes of the coalition. But of course, ultimately, the coalition has been united in this policy, and the people who have driven it most determinedly are not Scholz himself, in fact, but his two allies in the Green Party, Robert Habeck, the economics minister and vice-chancellor, and Annalena Baerbock, the foreign minister, and nobody suggesting that they will have to quit. So I don't see why replacing Olaf Scholz with Pistorius, who's also taken a very hard line on the conflict in Ukraine, how that's going to change anything or improve anything for the coalition or help to resolve its problems. And I certainly don't see how such a change will lead to a change in course by the existing government in Berlin. What it might suggest is that the government itself is starting to break down. It's starting to sort of crack. There's apparently been an opinion poll in Saxony, which is, of course, one of the states of the former East Germany, which shows the SPD there with only 3% of the vote. The leading party in Saxony is the AfD, with 37% of the vote. Saxony, I understand, is the region of Eastern Germany of which Dresden is the capital. The AfD is ahead of the CDU, which apparently there has 32% of the vote. The CDU has been the ruling party in Saxony up to now. And there is an election apparently due, a regional election due in Saxony in about 8 months' time. And so far, the polling numbers for the SPD don't look at all good. And as I said, the AfD seems to be gaining ground in Saxony. So it could be that these rumours about Scholz are in somehow connected to that event, to those opinion polls, and to worries about the SPD losing its position in the parliament, the local parliament in Saxony, which would, I understand, be the first time in its history that the SPD is not represented in one of the parliaments of the Länder. So, it could be that that is what is causing all of these rumblings. But again, to repeat once more, I don't see why dumping Scholz and bringing in Boris Pistorius, how that's going to improve the position of the SPD in Saxony, and I don't see how it's going to change the policies. If the government itself finally falls and there is a new election in Germany, then that might make for more of a difference. But I would say also that the most likely outcome of such an election is a victory for the CDU-CSU, which of course also supports the current policy with respect to Ukraine. So all of these events taking place in Europe, but of course they are creating nervousness and tension. And of course, if Scholz does fall, well, it would be another case of the Zelensky curse, what my colleague and friend calls Alex Christoforou calls the Zelensky curse, having its effect. But anyway, let's wait and see what does happen in Germany. And at the moment, as I said, these are rumours circulating and which have been picked up by La Repubblica. We don't yet know how much weight to place on them. So, tensions in Europe, perhaps. Complaints in France, apparently, that the country, industrial production in France fell in December. Complaints from some French political leaders and industrialists that, again, France has got itself into a cul-de-sac. It really has no way forward with this policy. But again, no sign that President Macron's government is going to change course. Apparently, President Macron, like the British government, has concluded that France has no more weapons that it can usefully send to Ukraine. It's talking about helping the Ukrainians improve their own production. We've seen that producing weapons in Ukraine is probably something of a fool's errand, given that the Russians are able to send missiles to any part of Ukraine that they wish. But even if there is going to be a reduction in French military aid to Ukraine, again, no real sign of a change of policy, no real sign of any kind of diplomatic or political initiative, be it from Germany or from France, to find some way out of this war. The only hint of such a thing that exists up to this point came from that meeting between Vladimir Putin and the Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar, and the further explanation given by the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, that apparently the Russians have been contacted and that they've been told that there is some European leader who wants to speak with them. But whatever or whoever that is, it doesn't seem as if this person is really coming forward with any new ideas. So the war grinds on. The missile attacks will continue to come. There might be a Christmas truce, but the Russians will resume their offensive thereafter. And Ukraine continues to be in severe difficulties. And here perhaps a few more points can be made. Apparently, there's now a report circulating in Ukraine. This comes from Ukrainian official sources, that it's impossible for Ukraine to make artillery ammunition because Ukraine doesn't have the chemicals to create the explosives needed to make shells in anything like the necessary quantities that would make a difference on the battlefields. So, we get reports of that kind, and it looks as if the long-running argument between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky over the mobilization continues unresolved, and despite much talk about a further call-up of 500,000 men, the mobilization law that has been under discussion in Ukraine for many weeks now has still not been finalized. By contrast, the Russians have continued to say that 1,500 men apply to join the Russian military every day. The recruitment surge that began in 2023 continues. And the same source who's provided me with all that information about Russian missile strikes has now provided some updates about Russian artillery production. He's informed me that Jane's, which is often taken as the authoritative publication on military matters, it's a British publication, they were putting Russian artillery shell production, at 200,000 a year, just before the start of the conflict. He says that this number has now jumped multiple fold and is now in the 4 million range, 4 million in a year. And he also confirms, at least he says, that there has indeed been a major surge in artillery production over the last few weeks, that there was indeed steps taken in 2022 and 2023 to expand production of shells by very great factor, and that this is now just starting to have an effect, and that over the last 2 months, there has been my estimate is the last 2 months, there has suddenly been a major surge in Russian artillery production, and this will probably expand even further in 2024, so that we're now seeing production of around 4 million shells a year, and probably production soon will be even higher. So there we go. Despite all of this, despite all of these problems, no sign of any diplomatic activity. The Russians repeatedly pointing out that it's hopeless even talking to the Ukrainians at the moment. President Zelensky has outlawed any negotiations between the Ukrainian government and Russia. So what is there, therefore, to talk about? And the war grinds on, and we move inexorably towards that situation in the spring, when a number of, I think, very, very disturbing things are going to start to happen. Firstly, probably sometime in February, we will see an announcement from the Western powers that they are seizing Russian assets, possibly arguing that there's some kind of preemptive reparations, which seems an astonishing idea. But anyway, that announcement is going to be made, and it's going to have undoubted global repercussions. And probably in the spring, this is my own guess, we will see the tempo of Russian military operations begin to intensify, especially after the spring Rasputitsa season is out of the way. And we will see whether that does develop into a larger offensive. I know there are some Russians who think that it will, and we will see what the consequences of that are. In the meantime, even as talk continues to circulate in the West about seizing Russian assets, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Ethiopia, Egypt, all of them have now just joined the BRICS. So the BRICS has been expanded. Argentina has decided that it will not participate, but all of the other countries that were invited to join the BRICS in August and the summit in South Africa, they have now done so. Iran as well, obviously. So all of these countries are now full members of the BRICS. And if we talk about Iran briefly, the country continues to remain under significant pressure. There's been a massive bomb attack in the cemetery where the assassinated Iranian general Soleimani was buried. Apparently 70 people have been killed. We're not yet told who was responsible for that particular attack. But overall, the situation in Iran seems to be more stable than it has been. The government seems to be more coherent than it was during the period when Mr. Rouhani was president. And as was pointed out to Glenn Deason and myself in a recent program that we did with him by Professor Marandi of Tehran University, the Iranian economy is now growing fast. It's achieving growth rates of above 7%, as the restrictive walls around Iran, its economy, begin to come down. And the Iranians have just made some further statements saying that given that they have now agreed a free trade agreement with the Eurasian Economic Union, and given that they have now joined the BRICS, they're no longer pursuing membership of the World Trade Organization because that has become irrelevant to them. It is no longer of any relevance. So, we see that continued tensions. We see how, however, the moves by the West to seize Russian assets are happening even as BRICS membership is expanding. And as Putin has just reminded us, this year Russia will be chairing the BRICS. And by the way, it is also chairing the Commonwealth of Independent States, this grouping of ex-Soviet states that was set up in substitution for the Soviet Union back in December 1991, when the Soviet Union itself was dissolved. The CIS has never really functioned, or it's never functioned to any very important degree, but it does still exist. It still retains a secretariat, and the Russians are now chairing it. So the Russians, fortuitously, are in a position to start operating chairmanships of the BRICS, of the CIS. Of course, they already dominate the Collective Security Treaty Organization, made up again of ex-Soviet states, and the Eurasian Economic Union, which they're working together, integrating with the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but they're in a strong position to organise whatever responses they need to at an international level to any Western attempts to the Western intentions to seize their assets. And of course, what the Russians will principally be doing is working towards developing the Brics financial and trade architecture, and following Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar's visit to Russia, which lasted for an extraordinary 5 days. Apparently, Prime Minister Modi has been invited to Russia, and he will shortly be there also. And no doubt there will be more discussions about all of this with the Russians. So, lots of developments on these fronts, but a continued paralysis in terms of Western diplomacy. And I think this is becoming increasingly dangerous and increasingly concerning. I think that more and more countries around the world are starting to note that both over developments in Ukraine and over developments in the Middle East, the West seems to have no plan or idea of what it wants to do. In terms of the situation in the Middle East, I'm seeing reports now starting to appear about concerns expressed as to exactly what the American intentions are. In the Red Sea, for example, there is a large number of US warships in the Red Sea, supposedly protecting merchant ships. Merchant ships, however, are still being attacked. Apparently Maersk, one of the big shipping companies, has now said that they're no longer going to send their ships into the Red Sea. It's becoming altogether too dangerous. The United States doesn't seem to have at the moment a clear plan what to do. Some want to escalate the situation by launching strikes on the Houthis. Others apparently don't. And the warships there in the Red Sea, sailing around, for the moment, doing nothing very much except putting themselves in the line of fire and creating a potentially very dangerous situation. I have never known a time, and I've said this on many programs, but I want to reiterate this again. I have never known a time when Western diplomacy seemed so completely adrift. And I think that obviously this creates opportunities for other states, for the Russians, for the Chinese, for the Iranians, for the South Africans, for the Brazilians. But of course it also causes problems, because without an active Western diplomacy, given the fact that the Western powers remain extremely powerful, it is extremely difficult to come to any kind of agreements about how to manage the various crises that are happening around the world. And in the case of Ukraine, with every day that this war continues, and it's a point I have made many times, the opportunities for diplomacy continue to close. Foreign Minister Lavrov made that point just a few days before the new year in one of the two big interviews that he gave. He said that yes, the Russians are prepared to sit down and talk and listen to whatever people have to say. But with every day that doesn't happen, that makes future negotiations, more difficult. And he is, of course, absolutely right. But one gets the sense that nowhere, in no part of the West, whether it be over Ukraine, relations with Russia, relations in the Middle East, relations with China. There was a big summit meeting at the Filofi Ranch in California. It's clear that nothing between the United States and China was resolved there. In all of these areas, there is, one senses, a growing paralysis, no real sign of anybody having any plan about what to do. And into that, all sorts of dangerous ideas like that, the one from FM Sikorski about giving Ukraine long-range missiles so that it can strike deep into Russia. These dangerous ideas start to grow. If 2024 continues like this, we will get more than just a debacle in Ukraine and perhaps in the Middle East. We could very well find ourselves drifting into an uncontrolled crisis with nobody having any clear idea of what to do or of where it is going. But that seems to be the situation at the moment, with the United States increasingly distracted by its own internal problems and the pending election, and with European leaders paralyzed, uncertain what to do in the absence of any lead from the United States, and of course not knowing what the Americans themselves might choose to do after the election in November. Well, as I said, I have never in my lifetime known a time quite like this. We'll see whether it continues through 2024. If it does, then as I've said, I suspect grave consequences will follow. Well, that finishes my video today. Slightly shorter than some of my other ones, but as I said, we've had further a lack of news from the Ukrainian battlefronts to cover. We'll see whether Putin does announce his Christmas truce. He, at least, I must say, does have plans, but we will see whether anybody in the West is able to come up with any. At the moment, doesn't seem very likely. But this is where today's video ends. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop. You can find all our amazing things there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.